Afternoon from London, but I know we have people joining us from different countries today, so good morning, good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are joining us from. Welcome to this webinar on Playing by the Paris Rulebook, what countries need to do now to measure their climate change goals. I'm Siobhan Benita, I'm a former UK senior civil servant, and I'm delighted to be chairing this webinar on behalf of Global Government Forum. That's a publishing house that serves civil servants all around the world, and with our knowledge partner today, N0. In terms of today's topic, the COP26 conference in Glasgow set out some rules on net zero, including how countries should count their carbon emissions, the timeframes for emissions reductions, and common reporting of industrial support as examples. This session is going to look at the extent to which governments are following these rules, what measures are being used to track emissions, how transparent the reporting arrangements are, how these systems can build trust between governments, between different sectors and with citizens, and where international best practice is leading the way. We have a really great expert panel with us here today, and they're going to be discussing all of those issues and more. In a moment, I'm going to introduce each of our speakers, and then I'm going to invite them to give some short opening remarks. But once you've heard from our speakers, we're going to make this more interactive. So it's your chance as an audience as well to put any questions that you've got to our speakers. So on your device, you should see somewhere a Q&A button. You can use that button at any point from now on to message in your questions, and we'll get through as many of those as we can before the end of the webinar. So in terms of our fantastic panel today, first we'll hear from Mike Thompson, who is the Chief Economist at the Climate Change Committee here in the UK. It's a committee which provides independent evidence-based advice on the UK's climate targets, plans, and progress in delivering them. Mike has been part of the CCC senior team since its creation in 2007, and he led its groundbreaking 2019 report that recommended a 2050 net zero target for the UK. Then we'll head over to Guatemala, where we'll hear from Jose Furlan, who is Climate Change Manager at the Rainforest Alliance, where he implements programs with the Ministry of Environment and Natural Resources in Guatemala. From 2014 to 2019, Jose helped with the formulation of Guatemala's low emissions development strategy, including coordinating activities with small producers. And he worked on the design of tools for monitoring greenhouse gas emissions with private sector agricultural associations. Then we're going to head over to the United States, where we'll hear from Josh Griffin, who is co-founder and chief policy officer at N0. Josh is a former elected state legislator, and he's represented a number of the largest tech and healthcare companies in the world. As Chief Policy Officer of N0, he connects N0's data-driven solutions to companies, to governments, and to communities that are looking for better information to meet their financial and sustainability objectives. And last, but by no means least, we stay in the United States, where we'll hear from Laurence Noé, who is Research Manager at the Open Data Watch, where he specializes in work around data financing, statistical capacity, and data use, with a particular focus on gender, climate change, and foundational data systems. Prior to working at ODW, he served as a senior research analyst at the Brookings Institution. So I'm sure you'll agree with me that I wasn't joking when I said we have a fantastic panel with us here today. We really, really do. Please use this opportunity to put as many of your questions as you would like to that panel by using that Q&A button at any point. But now, without further ado, I'm going to invite Mike to give us some opening remarks. Over to you, Mike.
Thank you, Siobhan, and hello everyone, wherever you are joining us from. Great to be here with you. I'm going to kind of open out this question of measurement and of playing by the Paris Rulebook to think beyond emissions, actually, and to think in terms of actions, the things that we need to be doing to get emissions down. We at the UK Climate Committee have recently introduced a new monitoring framework that is really trying to focus beyond emissions into those actions, because we think that's where we need to be now as a world. We've got a good set of net zero targets globally. Those are covering 90% or so of global economic activity. But what we haven't done yet is translate that sufficiently into nearer term targets and into the actions to actually deliver on them, into the implementation. That's the big challenge that we face globally, and it's the challenge that we're facing in the UK as well. And I'll split that roughly into two parts. So I'll talk first of all about the UK story, where we are at the moment, and then I'll talk about the monitoring framework that we have introduced at the Climate Change Committee. And the UK story on climate goes back probably a couple of decades now, really, when we started having a serious push on climate. My organisation was set up in 2008 under the Climate Change Act. That was the world's first piece of legislation to introduce legally binding climate targets, emissions targets. But it really has sped up for us in the last few years, beginning with that net zero target that we introduced in 2019. And that has been a real watershed moment, actually. It's been interesting to see how it's played out within the business community, particularly in the UK. We used to have an 80% target for 2050 before the net zero target. And going from 80% to 100% has really changed the conversation for some of those businesses that thought, well, maybe they were in the 20%. And there was more than 20% of emissions that thought maybe they were in the 20% and maybe they didn't actually have to cut their emissions. What we found now with a 100% target with net zero is it's made it really clear to everybody that all of the emissions have got to go. And that has meant we've shifted from a kind of question of if we should cut our emissions in certain areas into how do we do it. It's really focused onto how do we go about this cutting of emissions. If I move on then, 2020, the year after that net zero target, we translated it then into a pathway to net zero, and we set targets from now right out to 2037, covering all of those years, and including, of course, the nationally determined contribution that we put forward to the UN process. And those slightly front load the effort to 2050. So we're cutting emissions more quickly in the period through the 2030s than we expect to through the 2040s. So we've front loaded that effort as we need to contribute to Paris. Last year in 2021, the government put forward what it called its net zero strategy. And this was its laying out of its plans as to how it intended to meet those emissions targets. And this is when it starts to kind of get down to the sorts of actions that we need to happen. And this is the sort of thing, I think, that makes our job in monitoring progress an awful lot easier, because in that plan, the government put forward what is essentially the only real route through this, which is a big expansion of renewable electricity generation, electrification across the economy as far as that is possible, supplemented with a bit of hydrogen, a bit of carbon capture where electrification isn't a good option, and with a major land use change alongside it to suck CO2 out of the atmosphere as well, and compensate for those last bits of emissions that we're not able to get to zero. And they espouse that plan right through from now to 2050. And so they set, for example, the emissions they expect to see in each sector of the economy, whether it's transport or industry or the power sector. And then interestingly, they backed it up with technology targets. So we've got targets for decarbonising the power sector fully by 2035, having 50 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. That's roughly a quadrupling from today. Having a hydrogen target, 10 gigawatts by 2030, a tree planting target, a carbon capture target, a removals target. Across all of the relevant bits, they've set their goal in terms of where they want to get to. Now, what we would like to see now, what we thought by this point, a year later from that strategy, we would see is a full set of properly worked up and implemented policies to deliver on that and to see the actions come forward. And we do have that in some areas, but I'm afraid to say at the moment, we don't have it in all areas. Our assessment is that in the UK at the moment, the policies that we've put forward, particularly good in the power sector, particularly good in the transport sector, those will be enough to deliver maybe half of the emissions reductions that we need. But in the rest of the economy, the other half, particularly heating in buildings, in agriculture and land use, we think there are major risks attached to the current plans, or we just don't have enough detail as to how policy is going to be developed and lead us to where we need to get to. And so let me go then on to the second bit. That's kind of where we are in the UK. And I want to be clear, actually, that's kind of a linear progression. But the reality, of course, is that policy has been getting developed throughout that period. So there's no kind of idea that you delay until you've got all your targets in place and then bring forward your policy. These things absolutely can happen together. Yeah, let me go on to the second half to talk about the monitoring framework that we've introduced, because I think it's an interesting one to use more widely. And we've kind of introduced 4 levels that we look at. At the top, we look at emissions. Are they falling at the rate that we expect them to across the sectors as we expect them to? The next level, then, we look at the outcomes and the actions that are happening. That might be, for example, the level of investment in offshore wind. It might be the shift from private cars to public transport, supply and demand side actions that take us closer to that emissions goal. And because the government has set those technology targets, we've got some quite specific things to track against in those areas. The next level below that, I think, then is the more interesting one, actually. That's the enablers. It's the conditions for success. So then we're getting into tracking, well, if those investments are going to happen, not just now, but in the coming years, well, are we seeing public attitudes move as we need to see them to? Are we seeing people want to take up electric vehicles, want to take up heat pumps, for example? Are we seeing the technologies and the costs coming down at the rate that they need to, not just in a spreadsheet, but in the real world, in the economy, in terms of the offerings that people face? Are we seeing the supply chains developing rapidly enough to scale up and meet that future market if it is there? And are we seeing the skills, for example, or any bottlenecks in planning and that sort of thing come in? And then the final level that we look at is policy. Are the policies there to drive those changes? And so we're looking there for, is there a credible delivery mechanism that's been put forward? Are the funding levels and the incentives implied by those policies sufficient to get the rates of change we need at those higher levels? Are the enablers being put in place to make this happen? Are the barriers being unpicked to stop those preventing progress? And if we don't have a full set of policies yet, have we got a timeline as to when those policies will be brought forward and when the gaps will be filled in? That's all kind of published on our website, and I think it's a useful useful way into this, I think. And really interesting, I think, is the point of trying to get past emissions, which tells us about what we have done, and get more into the things that tell us about where we're going, forward indicators through policy, through those enablers. I also want to end just with a quick plug for the International Climate Council's network that we are a part of, and Guatemala is a part of, and Canada and Australia, and there's over 20 countries now represented in that group, covering all the continents of the world, bringing together the expertise of different climate advisors to try and learn from each other and to share best practice and make sure that we are doing our bit to help governments to do their bit and to move this forward as fast as we can. And I think I'll just leave on that note of don't delay. We need to get on with it.
Thanks so much, Mike. So I didn't catch, it was called the International Climate
Council's network. So it's a group of independent climate advisors like ourselves. Some are called committees, some are called councils, some are commissions as a whole.
Fab. What we can do is we can send the kind of details of that out to everybody who's in the audience and registered for today's webinar.
Fabulous, thank you.
Really great way to set the scene for the conversation today. Interesting to see that kind of development in the UK, how it's progressed from the kind of net zero targets with, as you say, that first kind of piece of legislation, setting this into law, and then how you move from the strategies to the plans. But then really interesting here to hear that kind of holistic view of monitoring, how you're looking at not just the emissions, but the expected outcomes that you would see at this stage, the conditions, the enabling kind of conditions for success, and then really crucial whether the right policies are in place to drive change. So I think lots in there that we can unpick as we get into the conversation. Thank you so much, Mike. Jose, I'm coming to you now.
Thanks, Yvonne. Great to meet everybody here, and it's a pleasure to share with so experienced panelists. I'm going to talk to you about the experience here in Guatemala, about how big challenges we've had to gather data. As many of our audience might know, developing countries do not have a culture of keeping track of data. So when we joined the UNFCCC and we started doing our reporting, we didn't have a lot of information and where to start and how to set our baseline. We got support from international organizations and did our first inventory by the start of this century in 20.
I think Jose has connection has gone down for a moment. While we wait for Jose to come back, Jose,
Hello? Can you hear me now?
yeah,
okay.
All good.
Okay. I think there was an internet disruption here at the office, but I think everything's going back to normal.
No problem.
So as I was telling you, we did our first inventory using a 1990 baseline, and but after that we did not do any further progress. Then we set up our Ministry of Environment. Our Ministry of Environment was set up in 2003, and then we started doing further research to get data on how our emissions were going. By the time we had to present our INDC before the Paris Agreement in 2015, we only had inventories back on up to 2005. So we had to project how things were going to work in 2030 with data from 15 years back, 10 years back. So we had considerable challenges. However, we had just set up our climate change council because we in 2013 we set up our climate change framework law, and we got a lot of support from private sector, from academia, to identify some trends that might set us up on how we can provide the world a proposal on how we are going to reduce our emissions, or not say reduce per se, but reduce our growth emission. We were seeking a growth of probably 1 million tons per year. So we decided, okay, if we're growing 1 million tons per year, let's lower that rate. Let's cut that growth rate by 10%. And if we get further support, reduce that rate for 20% additionally. However, we did not have a route so that we could say, these are the policies that we are going to set up. But we started developing our low emission development strategy. In 2016, we started developing this development strategy with support from cooperation agencies. And we started identifying the policies that might be set up in order to, so that we could reduce our emissions in a specific sector, how the energy sector would be doing, how the livestock sector, how the agriculture and forestry would support emission reduction. Although we had identified these options, we did not have a specific policy that would say, okay, this is what we're doing. So in the last 2 or 3 years, we have updated data so that we have official reports on how are we doing on our emission growth, and how our policies that have been set up initially are supporting, and where can we go further. So during the last year, we conducted a process so that proposals were taken to identify the sectors where we are going to target emission reductions for 2030. We're not thinking already 2050, but identifying actions for 2030. We have identified actions to reduce emissions in the energy sector, in the forestry section, livestock sector. We still have gaps in, for instance, transport sector, in other agriculture actions that need to be reduced, because we're a mostly agriculture country, but do not have all that information and data, because we have 40% of population doing agriculture and do not know how everybody is doing their actions. that's why we cannot set up specific policies, specific targets in order to do that. So that's why we in the upcoming years we are going to try to set up specific targets. The government is doing a considerable amount of work coordinating with the private sector, with NGOs, with civil society organizations, and academia that might help identify how specific sector actions can be set in place so that Guatemala can identify other activities to reduce emissions throughout the country. That's basically the baseline that we are now. I have told you about what we've done in the last probably 20 or 30 years to set up our monitoring systems, and this is where we are starting, our starting point for the upcoming years, and that's what our government and our Climate Change Council is pushing. I'm not sure if I think I got all the 7 minutes, so I will give you back the time.
Thanks so much, Jose. Really interesting, the focus that you put there on the challenge around data. I think that the need to have robust and reliable data, as you've set out there, really important if you're going to make sure you have the right policies in place, and also with kind of, especially with limited resources, if you're going to target those resources to where you can reduce emissions most effectively, then that importance of good data coming through very strongly from what you say there. As you mentioned, linking back to what Mike said, that you've got this Climate Change Council set up in law, brings together all those stakeholders to help kind of look at some of these solutions together, and also echoing what Mike said there around that kind of sector approach, how in some sectors there's a lot more progress than in others, and you've got policies in some sectors but a lot more to be done in others. Thank you so much, Jose. Really, really interesting to get the perspective from Guatemala. Josh, I'm coming over to you now.
Thank you. And this is a great panel to be a part of, so I very much appreciate being part of it, and greetings to everybody wherever you are. I've just got a couple of quick slides, but maybe before we zip through them, and I don't mean these slides to come across as just an N0 commercial, so let me set it up. But my own personal background isn't a natural one from climate tech and data science in particular, but it's a state public policy background. I've worked in state governments, mostly in the Mountain West here in the US, from being based out of Las Vegas for the past 25 years. And in working in state policies, one thing that is abundantly clear when you're talking about energy policy and sustainable policy, while there might be many disagreements, it's the most helpful if those disagreements can at least be centered around information that everybody agrees to, and that the lack of transparent data and climate data and sustainability data and emission data was missing, not only from making good public policy, but for businesses and some of our customers from making the right decisions and being able to make those operational decisions. So from there, N0 was born a few years ago. And again, the problem, and now that we're in the slides, thank you, it's very obvious that accurate climate data matters more than ever. And it's not just in these big sort of global senses of which is very important, obviously, and how we as a global community keep ourselves accountable and our neighbors accountable and all those things. But what does, at the sort of small level, how does a consumer make a decision? How does a city government, municipal government make operational decisions? How does we're quite involved in the hospitality space. So how does a hotel make a decision in terms of their operations? We're very engaged in the agriculture space. How does an agricultural operation make decisions? And so we've identified the problem as really in a both a macro sense and a micro sense as access to good data. If you can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. Obviously, that sets us up from our standpoint as is this the best information available to anyone, anywhere. And again, it's estimates and last month's or last quarter's or last year's aggregate information is a start, but it does not help operational decisions. As we know, emissions do come from operations, and we can identify sectors, we can identify real estate, we can identify vehicles and transportation, and they all count. But if you're an organization, if you're a government entity, if you're a state government entity, if you're again a business, you need to know all of that information, and to try and segment it or compartmentalize it makes it very difficult to make investment and reporting decisions. So again, I'll go to the next slide if you can. Thank you. We want to provide we do provide carbon transparency to again make these from a public policy standpoint. What can City Hall do? What can congressional committees do? But also, what can boards of directors do that are not only trying to have their companies be more responsible, but to provide information to their customers? I again made reference, we're very engaged in a lot of different sectors, but even in the hospitality space, if you're a hotel casino or a convention operator on the Las Vegas Strip, you're having your convention customers who are from all around the world saying, I want to know what my impacts are for my convention. And it's not an estimate of last year's, it's if I took 1,000 square foot booth at the South Hall at the Las Vegas Convention Center, what did that mean? What did that mean? And the only way you can really get to those levels of granular detail is if you have 24/7 real-time or near real-time emission factors. And it's not, again, we can see here, the more information and the more data we can get, scope 1, 2, and 3 are all available and can become more available. And we certainly have a long way to go to get that data in the right way. But the beauty of data and accurate data and transparent data is that it can start to seam together. So if here in the US, if the Security and Exchange Commission adopts, they've proposed rules to sort of require, if you're going to be a company that makes emission reducing announcements, to track that and to know that. If you start seeing those things sort of seam together, now all of a sudden what the agriculture community starts adopting from the same data sets, and what the hospitality industry starts adopting from the same data sets and providing to their customers, that can trickle up to policymakers. I think a lot of time we look at these big policy decisions as being top down. Well, as we all know, the market, consumers and people are demanding, they want to know what they can do, and what can, how can I travel, or how can I, make purchasing decisions. And so that, again, the solution is far more focused on that level of transparent data. Next slide, please. Thank you. The other thing that we think is critical, and you can just see a little sample of it here. This is great. We have, again, we have customers in the private sector, in the public sector, but help and share the story. And our small local municipal governments and cities, we sort of peel the veil back a little bit and say, okay, here's your estimates of how you're reducing your emissions. But sometimes, as we know, that's an accounting function. We did offsets, and we are taking it from an estimate from last year, and we had renewable energy credits and all those things. All tools in the past that led us to a point, but now everybody wants to know, what is our real story? How do we share publicly? So many of our government customers actually put the N0 platform on the City Hall on the city website, or we're just going to start putting them in monitors in the convention center industry, so people can see not what happened last year, but what happened yesterday. And more importantly, what are we doing to address that? Obviously, I'm based in the Mountain West of the US, where solar is a very available energy resource. So for a convention center or a company or a city to maybe have limited resources to go invest, buying more unique solar might not necessarily drive their emissions down as much as opposed to converting their heat pumps to from a gas heat pump to a hybrid electric heat pump, or a different refrigerant, depending on how that gets used in their cooling systems. And so when you can see all that in real time and in real accurate, share it, share your strengths, share what you're doing wrong. Everybody's got a stake in this. And so We're lucky to work with some really forward-thinking policymakers and elected officials at the city level and at the state level that are very exciting to work with. And it's important to share the story. I think that might have been my last one. I can't remember if I had one more slide or not. I think that was my last. If it is, that's good. Oh no, I did have one more slide. Sorry. And again, this is just a final up of why accurate data matters again. And when you look at estimates versus actuals, you can see that the reporting has been inaccurate, and in some cases, they're underreporting your footprint. That doesn't mean you're all done working on it, but it allows for you now to redeploy resources in an area that you can drive these down further. And you can take the slides off if you want. Thank you. But I think again, how I would sort of summarize it, and I open up with a public policy background and how N0 is a resource to policymakers. But we look at governments as much as a customer as well, because as cities start sharing and states start sharing their emissions from City Hall and from departments of transportation and vehicle tracking, and you start getting in all those data sources, and you start getting into your employee commutes and your travel procurement procedures in the supply chain, all those types of things. They become also leaders for the private industries in their states. And rather than, again, that sort of top-down request of here's what you need to do, it becomes a much more collaborative discussion of here's what we can do for together. So sorry about that. I know I rambled on a bit long there, but
no, that's good. Thanks, Joss. I mean, I never thought I would hear Las Vegas and talks about climate change in the same conversation, but
it's part of the story that we need to tell around the world. The things that the Las Vegas resort community are doing in the era of climate, they're making really, really smart investments and cutting edge investments. We all have a long way to go.
It's good to hear what you were saying about how if you provide information, then businesses, cities, organizations, even individuals can make more informed decisions in order to help them kind of reduce their emissions, and also across their operations as well. You stressing what Jose was talking about there as well, the importance of accurate data, and you're saying as well the provision of real-time accurate data, very important for some people. And I like that sense of then if enough people use this to change the way they do things, and that trickles back up policymakers as well. We'll also come on, you mentioned their underreporting and how some people, when they've used these solutions, find they've been underreporting, because we've already had a question come in about that. So I'll come back to that in a moment. Just before we go to our final opening presentation, a reminder to the audience, please do get your questions coming in on absolutely anything you've heard already, but any other questions you brought to this webinar in advance to do with emissions and the reporting of emissions. But Lorenz, now over to you.
Thanks, Siobhan. Thanks so much for having me at this event. It's great to hear from all these other speakers across sort of local and national efforts to better track climate change data. A quick word, again, you've already really well introduced myself and Open Data Watch, but just to kind of emphasize our perspective on this is that international nonprofit organization working at the intersection of official statistics and open data. And so what this really means in concrete terms is that we focus on data produced and published by governments. This means we work with a range of actors in national statistical offices, for example, as well as across the national statistical systems in countries. And our goal is to make this lasting changes to improving the availability and openness of official statistics. Next slide, please. So real quick, today I'll talk about sort of the data value chain framework that we have at Open Data Watch, our open data inventory and climate change data, as well as moving a bit towards a enabling environment for climate data. Next slide, please. So this is the data value chain, which is a framework ODW uses to understand the activities of official statistics and how to get from business as usual in production to greater use of government data that then has an impact and therefore has greater value as a result. With climate change data, as with all data systems, we want to encourage greater focus on uptake and impact of data in a country's policies, both at the local level, as well as sort of then how emissions actually can go down, as well as at the international level, such as how countries report at these international treaties through their NDCs, for example, as well as, for example, the most recent global stock pick that's going on right now. A key component for us here is open data, which we see as a crucial precursor to greater uptake and impact. So to get from that sort of left-hand side of production and just for production's sake to greater use and impact on the right-hand side. Next slide, please. The way we do this and the way we assess this at the global level is through our open data inventory, which is covers around up to 90 or so countries, and explores the availability and openness of data. This is what we spend most of our time thinking about and analyzing country performance on. It's a key component here is that we look at data that are publicly available and findable through official government websites that are considered. There's a very big use component in how citizens would also engage with this data across a variety of sectors. You can see here we have a couple of different ways that we define whether data are available and whether they're open. And this is consistent with sort of global standards around open government data. Next slide, please. At the global level, the results of this biannual assessment, the most recent complete one was done in 2020, looks like this. So again, this is really the way we conceive of the revealed capacity of countries to produce data across many different development data sectors. And really, it does this across the sectors of environmental statistics, which I'll get to in a second, social statistics, and economic and financial statistics. Next slide, please. Overall, there are 22 data categories that are split among those three major categories. And you can see here that most relevant for this conversation, pollution, which we define as greenhouse gas emissions, as well as other pollutants emitted in terms of coverage and openness, is actually one of the worst performing data categories by how it's currently reported by countries, as well as the worst performing environmental category. So that's really an area where there's much more to be done. Next slide, please. So we're clearly struggling at the moment to meet these reporting requirements, but the problem for countries, of course, is that there's always more to report. These are extremely complex issues that at the global level are extremely important to people's livelihoods and lives. And so more and more data is only going to be demanded. Again, taking this sort of bird's eye view on the global reporting landscape, countries are reporting against a lot of these global international frameworks, such as the Enhanced Transparency Network framework, obviously the Sustainable Development Goals, and most recently the Global Set of Climate Change Indicators and Statistics, which all again place a huge demand on a country's data systems and make it all the more important that countries really adopt a really comprehensive approach. And it's been great to hear, for example, some examples from Guatemala and the UK already on how this is done at the country level. Next slide. So really, we think this again makes this all the more important to think about these data systems really as an ecosystem at the national level. This connects to work done by Paris 21 and Center for Open Data Enterprise, to partners of ours where they've done this work to really conceive of this data ecosystem at the country level, which involves mapping actors and data sources at the country and local levels, promote data sharing between those for greater reporting and use in policy, and institutionalizing the resulting collaboration among data users and producers so that you can use data for effective actions. Again, our main focus here is on openness, which we just think is very critical for climate data use and policy and advocacy. And moving forward, we're going to keep doing this by focusing on creating an open climate change data template together with, again, our partners, Paris 21 and Code, and bring our experience with open data to bear to identify high salience indicators, for example, and available indicators, as well as, again, connecting to openness standards that are really important here. At the same time, given that we work at the international statistical community, we are also sort of keeping up advocacy efforts so that international agencies do their part to help countries, again, many of which, of course, are at different levels of statistical capacity, to really make sure that we're leaving no stone left unturned to open more data. Most recently, the example is kind of joining a call by Our World in Data to have the International Energy Agency open up more of its data and make it more freely available so that it can be used by countries, researchers, and other citizens. So that's sort of where our focus lies. And again, our story is that kind of the use, thankfully, the use and adoption of open data has improved over time. But as you can see by reporting on pollution, for example, a lot still is left to do, and we really need, again, all kind of strings of countries and the international statistical system working together to improve that. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Lorenz. I mean, so interesting to hear what you do there, how you kind of work with the international statistical community. Your biennial open data inventory in particular, kind of ranking different countries in terms of how well they're doing, in terms of the openness of their data. Be interesting if any of the audience or any of the speakers as well were quite surprised by some of the where they sat on that map, I think, globally. But also really interesting what you're saying, that ironically pollution is one of the lowest in terms of the scores for how kind of available the data is and how robust the data is on that. And I think you're echoing what a lot of the other speakers have said already about the importance of data, but you're very much focused on the openness and accessibility of that data so that citizens, so that organizations can use that data. And then finally, what you say there about the role of Open Data Watch to help build capacity where people want to be more open with their data and want to have the best data available, that you play that kind of role as well. So thank you so much, Lorenz, for setting out, giving us an overview of what you do as well. I think complementing what our other speakers have said. Please, to the audience, get any questions coming in now, but I want to come back to all of you with one question really. So you've all talked about, you're all in the business of kind of measuring emissions reductions or looking at the data that is required, and the other, as you said, Mike, the other areas that you'll be looking at to see how well kind of countries are doing on meeting their targets. I just want to ask a very simple question ahead of the next COP, which is, to what extent is there agreement between nations and across nations on how emissions should be measured? And if there isn't kind of that global agreement yet on kind of the measurements, where are the biggest still areas of kind of divergence or disagreement amongst the international community on these measurements? Mike, I'm going to come back to you first because we haven't heard from you for a while.
Well, others may be better placed than me to talk to the international elements of that. I mean, the IPCC has some fairly specific guidance about how you should measure and report emissions. And certainly, you know, that from a UK point of view, that has, as that has developed and got more specific, for example, on peatlands, that has been really helpful for us in then implementing them in the UK's emissions inventory. So the UK recently increased our estimate for our level of emissions because we increased peatlands, which are pretty important in the UK as an emission source. That was off the back of the IPCC's work to put forward the best ways of doing that. So kind of that, I think, is a good framework. I think we're fairly lucky in the UK that we have a pretty rich inventory that's been well managed for quite a while. But as to how that plays out internationally, I'm sure others probably will have a better view than me.
Thanks, Mike. Well, Lorenz, you do have that kind of global overview. So is there kind of a standard agreement on how emissions are measured, reported on?
As someone not working in one of the statistical agencies, I can't comment exactly on kind of the exact measurement of the way emissions are measured at country level, but just echoing what Mike was saying, that again, thanks to these global guidelines and just the immense amount of work that's been going on at UNFCCC and IPCC over the years to standardize these definitions, I think that's definitely really helped to bring these definitions in line. I think what we were seeing up until last year, though, with COP is that COP26 still had quite a bit of disagreement between countries about, again, how these should be reported, sort of down to the nitty-gritty, like tables that should be submitted, and that was sort of finally worked out at the COP last year or so, where I think countries are able to now have a bit more flexibility based on their capacity to report data that are needed, but obviously still kind of be able to go reflect kind of just, again, the resources they have available to them, to not kind of place an undue burden on just countries that won't yet be able to make the same kind of reporting as more advanced countries.
Thanks, Amens. Josh, you work with lots of different organisations, different public sector and private sector organisations. So again, your thoughts on to what extent do people agree even on the way that emissions should be measured?
Maybe rather than highlight where we're coming up short, or highlight maybe some of the disagreements, because as we all know, this is hard, right? This is very challenging in how to go do that. But rather than maybe highlight those, what I would do is maybe just sort of cheerlead for doing more and cheerlead for doing better. I think the more granular, and again, it's a country's assessments and inventory are important, but they're only as good as their ability to really start breaking down in the most micro levels as possible within industries and organizations. And so what I would do is just continue to encourage and hope that we could all encourage more granular data, more transparent data. Progress is being made, but we have a very long way to go.
Okay, thanks, Josh. Jose, I'm going to ask you a similar question, but I'm going to phrase it in a slightly different way. You mentioned some sectors doing better than others in terms of kind of having benchmarks in place, but also starting to have a reporting structure in place. What are the biggest barriers for the sectors that aren't doing as well as you would like to see at the moment?
Well, for instance, for inventory reporting and for policy data, we think that the agriculture sector and the forestry sector can do better, because we have data that can monitor emissions for the country, and that we can compare it with other countries, as we are also doing the transition from 1996 guidelines to the latest guidelines from IPCC. But we can only measure the bunch of emissions, and not by specific actions that can be taken in place by policy. For instance, agriculture in Guatemala remains a major challenge. That, for instance, large-scale agriculture, they have their own tracking systems. For instance, banana producers, sugarcane producers, they have their own tracking systems, and they are already monitoring their data and presenting it publicly. But other sectors that should be measured by different actors, such as the Ministry of Agriculture, need to improve this kind of data, this kind of monitoring actions, so that they can identify effectivity of policy implementation.
Okay, thanks, Jose. And Mike, similarly, you said in your opening presentation where you've looked at the policies that you would expect to be in place now for sectors to be able to meet their ultimate objectives. We're seeing good progress in some areas, but I think you mentioned, for example, in heating, domestic heating, land use, for example, you aren't seeing as much as you would like to see. Similarly, as I asked Jose, why do you think that's the case? Why in some areas are we not seeing as much progress as in others?
Yeah, I mean, there's a real mix of reasons, actually. I mean, some of it is kind of straightforward technology stuff. You know, we're seeing more progress in in transport, because electric vehicles are moving on very well as a technological option, cheaper and better fundamentally at the end of the day, also helping with air quality. So there's real local pushes for them as well as national. There's definitely a resistance with heating. They say an Englishman's home is his castle and all that. Getting into what people do in their homes has been a kind of scary area for politicians. I think we're starting to see a consensus around what good policy looks like. That's been slower to come in areas like, in the power sector. I think we had pretty good consensus maybe, a dozen years ago about what good policy looked like. And it was fundamentally long-term contracts for generators. So I think some of it is that about just the fundamental difficulties. Agriculture, I think, is an interesting one where data has really been an issue. And that's been an issue in terms of really understanding what is going on, but also just in terms of designing policy instruments. Pretty easy to bring the power sector into an emissions trading scheme because we know with a good level of confidence what the emissions are. We can monitor it directly. For agriculture, where it's a really complicated mix of the diet that an animal eats and the way that it's reared, much harder to bring in that kind of instrument. So we've tended to have in agriculture voluntary type agreements that have been monitoring more the inputs than the outputs and the outcomes. And those voluntary instruments have not cut it, frankly. We need to have stronger instruments, and actually better data will make it a lot easier to bring in those stronger instruments, I think. So that definitely is one where data has been a key barrier.
Thanks, Mike. I'm going to go to a question that we had sent in from Michael Leah, who's from Canada. And Michael's question is about the kind of underreporting of high emissions and delays in reporting. And he's saying this is, hugely problematic. And how do you deal with that? How do you actually get kind of more accurate reporting? Even if you know what that looks like, how do you actually get around the issue of people trying to maybe underreport their emissions? How do you deal with that? Josh, you mentioned this in one of your studies with an organization. So how do you actually deal with the issue of underreporting and get people to move to a more, especially when you were saying the importance of telling your story? Is there not a risk that people are going to try and exaggerate the progress that they have made?
Yeah, and I'll probably answer a different question, but I mean it to lead into it. I mean, first of all, the great news is that, and it's not just N0, but there are tools to report accurately. There are many. It can be done. So the most important thing that an organization can do, whether it's a company or a government entity or anything, anything and everything, is they can decide that they're going to report accurately, and that there are tools to go do that. And they're not. It's not easy, but it is not impossible. And customers and constituents and markets and investors need to continue to demand it. I think we're probably all seeing that around the world, that investment decisions are now being targeted towards what are the impacts, and more importantly, what is the trajectory to lower those impacts. What I would say is continue to sort of flex our market power. And companies now are and governments are now giving tools to the market to make better decisions that are accurate, that are based on real emissions in real time, or at least in near real time, where that can matter. So tools do exist.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. Lorenz, in your kind of work, do you comment at all on the quality of the data as well as the openness? So would you, for example, if you think a country is underreporting their emissions or over-reporting their reductions, do you also comment on that?
It's a good question. So the short answer is we don't comment on that, simply because that's we have so many indicators and requires a bit more statistical capacity than we possess ourselves. We for the moment comment only on the availability and sort of openness of that data point, and then we obviously kind of highlight it. We point to the data point, and we then kind of leave it to the constituent experts to then kind of comment on the veracity of those data points. But I think on the issue of kind of underreporting, I guess I would sort of what Josh also was saying is that at this point, I think certainly on climate change data on emissions to nature abhors the vacuum of data, and so I think at this point we've seen so many great initiatives by researchers, civil society organizations, academia to fill in the gaps where they exist, and so I think that's sort of where we've thankfully been able to kind of plug some of the holes across where they currently are, and which again shouldn't supplant accurate kind of reporting at a standard level by all the parties, but you're able to kind of fill in kind of major producer gaps for emissions, for example, using some of these tools out there, because you're just able to bring to bear such an array of technologies and methodologies at this point that are able to kind of evaluate that. So I think that's a great strength of the current ecosystem.
Thanks, Lorenz. Mike, I mean, part of the point of having an independent kind of body looking at all of this surely must be to check the accuracy of the reporting. So do you comment on whether you think people are misreporting their emissions? And also this question of delay, to what extent do you have levers when people are prolonging their reporting as well?
Yeah, so we don't do it too often, but we do it every now and again. Is the answer. So we did a report, gosh, I forget when it was, around 2015 on measurement of greenhouse gas emissions in the UK, and we looked at the measurement in the inventory, and we looked at the uncertainty ranges, and we kind of cross compared against some of the other data sources that can give you insights as to whether the numbers seem to be right and so on. And we kind of concluded in that in most areas the UK inventory is pretty robust. It's a pretty good estimate of the level of emissions, and again agriculture and land use really was the exception to that, with a much bigger uncertainty ranges, much more scope for there to be errors in there, either under reporting or over reporting. And that kind of was matched actually by what the government was doing. You know, this wasn't a new finding, and government actually was putting a lot of resource into trying to improve those things as they should do, and they have improved quite a bit since then. The thing actually we were wary with that as much as anything was that it shouldn't be a barrier to making progress. Now, even in those areas where the inventory is not quite there, that makes some things more difficult, but we still know that there are actions that you can take which are positive actions and that help. And it's been I think it's been a bit of a smokescreen in the UK in that sector, you know, which is also a strong lobby sector. You know, the agricultural lobby is traditionally one that has the ear of government. It receives a lot of subsidies. It's a sensitive area because it's so important in rural constituencies. So I think it's been allowed to be a bit of an excuse for inaction. And I think that's our concern as much as anything with this, actually. Not just that we get it right, it's better to get it right, but that we don't let it be an excuse not to do things until we have it perfect.
Thanks, Mike. Jose, this issue of delay in reporting, I mean, you mentioned quite a lot in your presentation that you're still on a kind of building your capacity to get the data into a place where you want it to be. To what extent do you think you're going to be able to hit kind of the reporting targets that you would like to for COP27 and for the coming kind of years after that?
Well, we are trying to improve our tracking systems. For instance, we have our latest inventory for 2018. However, we think that we might be able to generate inventories 1 year delayed, for instance, for the industry and product use, energy sector, and waste. However, agriculture, forestry, and other land uses are the major challenges within the country. We might have inventories with probably 2 to 4 years delay because we don't have that well tracking systems. For instance, our energy sector, power supply, they can have data with 15 minutes delay. When we now can monitor how the energy sector did today at 8 in the morning. But other sectors, we still have to improve it. So I think we will be improving to have probably 2 to 3 years delay. but not have 10 years delay as we used to do it before the Paris Agreement.
Yeah, thanks, Jose. Lorenz, I'm going to come back to you with a specific question about your the report that you mentioned, your inventory. The question being, are there any surprises in the most recent report? I think you said 2020, in terms of countries that you would expect to be doing better in openness that maybe weren't doing as well as you would have expected? And also, what are the kind of most common barriers to more openness? Is it lack of political will? Is it lack of the technology? Kind of what are the biggest barriers that you're seeing to making data more accessible?
I think when you're kind of asking about kind of what are sort of the surprises, that I think some countries that are, again, we would, based on the amount of their sort of economic power, would do quite well, given that they have the resources to kind of set up these data systems, are doing more poorly. Include some countries in Europe, and I can say this because I'm from there. Germany, for example, has, I think, across the board is doing a lot of work right now to improve its digitalization efforts, but is still, I think, on some of these measures, not doing as well as perhaps sort of its economic sort of indicator would suggest. But at the same time, obviously, they still have, just through sheer force of resources, are able to kind of equalize some of that. As far as sort of where I think there's the most shortfall, I think probably the one that some people don't think about is sort of regular reporting too on terms of use. So making sure that users understand what are sort of the agreements that they enter into when they use data, which I think for a lot of users can be a barrier, and is something that is a weird oversight in kind of that. In kind of having the legal department, for example, talk to the physical department, and so it gets quite technical there, but it's also an area where it has the power of sort of then unlocking a lot of the data that are needed to make effective policies. So those are the two I would point to.
Great, thanks, Lorenz. And Josh, I've got a specific question for you. So to what extent, when you're working with organizations, with communities, you mentioned you work with cities, for example, as well, to what extent does a greater understanding of how they report and maybe communicate their kind of climate action actually drive change? So what are the biggest changes that you've seen as a result of people getting better at measuring their kind of climate action?
Sure. And I'll kind of aggregate different decisions that some of our municipal customers have made. And some of them are going to seem very easy now when you look at them. But just in one of the first changes was just, when do you charge your electric vehicle fleet? So if a city building inspector has a fleet of 20 electric vehicles, and the typical schedule is for the building inspector, that works at City Hall, come to City Hall at 8 in the morning or 8:30 in the morning, get your inspections, and then jump in the electric vehicle for the next several hours in the morning and do those inspections, and then come back in the afternoon and sort of data enter and follow up, and here's the things, and send the emails, here's all the follow-up things that you have to do. And then typically when that inspector would leave for the day, they would go plug the vehicle in at night. Well, and depending on where you are, this is why one of the things that's very important is just mapping the grid. What's the carbon content of the grid? Clearly, if you're in a sunny climate, don't charge it at night when you're going to have a fossil fuel resource, powering the grid. Do it when you're back at City Hall. So just changing operational procedures that now at the ideal, you must charge your vehicle from 1:30 to 4:30 and unplug it when you leave. So it's just and something like that. And the reason why accurate 24/7 data matters is because you can now track that. What does that mean? Just that operational change mean? In another city government that we had, there was all the recreational pools, which were very much kind of a summertime activity. The city was exploring putting rooftop solar on all of those pool areas. But again, the same issue. The grid was already relatively clean at the time that those were being operated, but converting to a different type of heat pump to electrify their heat pumps. Well, not only was that sort of capital investment significantly less but the emission reductions was actually slightly greater just because of how they were doing those types of things from an efficiency standpoint. I could go on, and I know we don't have time for me to go on, but it's those types of things. I mean, when you know those things in real time and you can look at those things, there are thousands of data points that you can get, and we automate that data in a way so it can, doesn't need just a person to go say it. It can automate the recommendations.
Thanks, Josh. I'm looking at the clock. I can't believe how fast the conversation has gone. So we've probably just got time for one more question, which I'm going to put to everybody. And I mean, I think it is only a matter of days now before COP27 opens in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. So my question to all of you is, what do you hope to see from COP27 when it comes to kind of the reporting and the measurement of climate action and emissions out of COP27? Do you think there'll be any big changes, or do you think it will be a kind of continuation of what we've seen up to now? Jose, I'm going to come to you first on this.
Well, for instance, here in Guatemala, we don't expect major changes for our countries, as we are working, trying to catch up with developing countries. We are already improving our monitoring system and our reporting systems. So we don't expect major changes for us. We have other expectations in other ranges of the COP, but for the reporting systems, we don't expect major changes, as we have already make the transition to a better reporting system.
Thanks, Jose. Lorenz, you were nodding there. Do you not expect any major changes, or what would you like to see coming out of COP27?
Yeah, I think from my understanding of what's to be expected is that, given that COP26 on sort of the transparency front was kind of where a lot of the action was taking place to kind of agree transparency dimensions. And so I think now that that's been agreed, I'd really kind of hope to see, I'm not expecting kind of major announcements, but I would like to kind of just see some more progress, I guess, behind the scenes of actually sort of implementing the enhanced transparency framework, and have kind of advanced economies lead on their reporting, kind of put their best place forward, so kind of establish those best practices. And then I think crucially also then help, and this may already be taking place, help countries catch up and kind of use the global community that exists to support better reporting in the future.
Thanks, Lorenz. Josh, your thoughts on what might come out of COP27?
I'll probably just have to sort of agree and maybe pile on to what was already said, which is, I mean, I've tried to be in the prediction business my whole life with limited success. So let's just talk about hope a little bit, but it's that continued progress. Obviously, the data exists, but having consistent standards to access the data, report the data, and make it as granular and as 24/7 as possible. When countries start, cooperating on that, it is so much easier for the sub-entities and companies and cities and all those things within those countries to join on. But the data exists. It's now a function of putting it in one transparent place.
Thanks. Mike, I started with you. I'm going to end with you, but I'm going to make your question slightly more tricky. So what do you want to see from COP27, but also how optimistic are you that the message coming out of COP27 is the world is on course to meet its targets? Okay, well, the UK obviously will hand over the presidency of COP when COP27 starts. We still hold it until that point. So let me link it back a bit to COP26, and we saw big shifts in ambition at COP26. You think of the big net zero commitments that came, some major shifts in NDCs as well. But we also saw this kind of really interesting dynamic that was sort of shifting a bit from the top-down policy-driven into the bottom-up. Everybody in was the phrase, and we had these various pledges launched around. We had the global methane pledge, we had one on electric vehicles, we had one on coal phase out. We had a whole sequence, a really important one on land use and forestry, of course. Now, those kind of were set up and started, but they haven't all come to fruition particularly yet. They haven't all got really solid governance and monitoring and rules around them actually to translate them into real action at the ground. And I think
you know, this COP is not going to be about big, new, bold ambitions. That's not what this will be. Clearly, there's going to be some really tough discussions around adaptation finance, around loss and damage, that, you know, are really, really difficult as international negotiations. What I hope is that kind of that bit on the side, the kind of the non-negotiation bit, the pledges, the kind of non-state actors, that those mechanisms, which again, they're really good ambitions, they've got some really good pledges in there, that those get the meat on the bones to really make them bite, so that they start to have a difference. Because, you know, it's very hard to be optimistic about the negotiations moving forward in much of a material way. You know, COP26 tried really hard to bring forward that ratchet up in ambition and to close that gap in 2030. And not a lot has happened in the last year. You know, that was the window really for doing it. We saw this at COP26. Most of the action happens between. Once you get there, you're not really going to see that much movement probably. So I think we've got to be realistic that, you know, we're not going to come out of COP27 and suddenly see that 2030 gap being closed. So I think the hope is more in those kind of non-state actor mechanisms, that we can get a bit more bottom-up action that will help to move things along, even where there isn't kind of a push down from the top. So I don't feel hugely optimistic, but I think if there is a bit of hope, that's maybe where it is, because, you know, business is looking to step up here, and it can move faster than national government. So maybe that's where there's a bit of hope.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Mark. I mean, we don't want to leave on an unrealistic note, so not overly optimistic, but as you're saying, there are kind of areas of hope there. And hopefully this conversation about the importance of getting the data that you need to be able to report accurately on the work that you're doing will be part of that positive work going forward. I would just like to say a big thank you to all of you on the panel. So to Jose, to Josh, to Lorenz, and to Mike, thank you so much for lending us your time and your expertise today. And there was a lot of stuff in there, I think, for people to unpack. What we will be doing is we will send the audience who were watching today, but everyone also who registered and might want to watch on demand, we will be sending them a link with today's video so they can watch that again. And there will also be an article published in a couple of weeks' time with the key points from today's conversation. So they will be sent that and they can share that with their colleagues as well. On the screen, talking of data, you will see we've put up information about one of our upcoming webinars. So if you are watching today's webinar and you're interested in all things to do with data, you can register for that. But on our website, on the Global Government Forum website, you will find information about lots more webinars that we have over the coming weeks and months as well. Thank you so much to N0 for being our knowledge partner today. And that just leaves me to say a big thank you to the audience. Hope you enjoy the rest of the day wherever you are watching from, and I hope that we see you very soon on one of our future webinars. Goodbye, everybody, and enjoy the rest of the day. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Hey.